Robbie's here to talk to us about the Bible. He's answering the question, is the Bible just a work of fictional literature? Robbie, tell us about yourself.
Well, I used to be an inmate here at Bristol. I did mechanical engineering. Any engineers here?
Yeah.
You poor people. Hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Ever. So exam is over, and yeah, there we go. So yeah, I was in Baydock as well. Any Baydock people?
Yeah.
Baydock. Yeah. There we go. And I'm now a refrigeration solutions engineer, which is as exciting as it sounds.
Robbie's been talking to about 20-25 minutes. Then there'll be a chance for questions. If you don't want to ask your question out loud, then you can text it to me. Yay! And the number will be on the screen at the end. So, yeah, over to you.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. A while ago, I was looking at the BBC website, and while I was having a look at it, there was a story out that apparently 25% of adults did not know where Jesus was born. And below the article was the Have Your Say section, which I think they've got rid of now. And one of the comments that someone left behind was very highly recommended, was this. The whole story surrounding Jesus is no more than a myth. Why is the BBC even bothering with this? Maybe you should be asking questions about Santa or the Tooth Fairy and where they were born. Now, for the next few moments, have a chat with whoever you're sitting next to about to what extent do you agree or disagree with that? What do you think? Go for it. Bringing the conversations to an end. Thank you very much. I'm sure you had some great conversations, and please do feel free to carry on those afterwards. Well, the Christian faith is based on the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And his life, teaching, death, and alleged resurrection are recorded in the Bible, and the New Testament to be more specific. Now, the Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, there he is, Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis sort of said that Jesus made some astounding claims, including the claim that he was God veiled in human flesh. Now, that claim can either be true or it can be false. If it was false, he either knew it was false or he didn't. If he did know that it was false, that means he was deliberately deceiving people into worshipping him, and that means that he's not a great moral teacher. That means he was a colossal liar, and he was actually quite malevolent. But if he didn't know that he was false in making those claims, in other words, he sincerely believed that he was God, then he's on par with a man who believes he's a poached egg, as C.S. Lewis said. So he's not a great moral teacher, he's a lunatic. He's actually a megalomaniac. He has bizarre views, grand views of himself that's just untrue. However, if those claims were true, then the logical conclusion is that he is the Lord, he is God. So, handy little mnemonic there, Lord, liar, lunatic. If Jesus doesn't bear the properties of the first two options, then it follows logically that he's the third, he's the Lord. However, Bart Ehrman, a noted historian, said that C.S. Lewis, and he points this out quite rightly, C.S. Lewis forgot one other option, legend. What if it's all rubbish? What if Jesus was a legend? What if the truth about the real Jesus has been lost to the murky depths of history? What if the basic pillars upon which Christianity is founded, what if those pillars are on unsound foundations? What does that mean for Christianity? Well, the Bible itself comes to a very sober conclusion. If Christ has not been raised, then your preaching is in vain, and then your preaching is in vain and your faith is useless. So, Christians among us, that's quite a sober thing to start, isn't it? If Jesus didn't come out from the dead, might as well just go home. Forget Christianity, it's rubbish, basically. So, if the accounts of Jesus and his resurrection and the hope that he offers to mankind are not true, then Christianity is of no importance to anyone, and it's the biggest mistake in all history. So, let's have a look at the evidence. Bartman claims that the Jesus we read about in the pages of the Gospels is simply the product of propaganda or legendary development. Does the evidence lead to that conclusion, or does it lead somewhere else? That's what we're going to have a look at today. So, how do you answer a question like that? How do you answer this sort of thing? Well, there's two questions we've got to ask ourselves. The first one is what we read now what was originally written, assuming accurate translation? And then, once you've answered that question, you then have to say, right, well, is what was originally written what actually happened in the first place? So those are the two questions we need to answer. And at this point, I have to briefly interrupt myself. We are going to be looking at the Gospels in particular. There's simply so much to cover that we pretty much have to stick to that part of the Bible. If you have questions about other parts of the Bible, please do feel free to raise those at the end. Now, so is what we read now what was originally written? Now, unfortunately, we don't have the original, say, Luke's Gospel that he actually wrote. We don't have that document. That's probably perished long ago. But that document was copied several times in order to distribute it around groups of early Christians. And then those copies were copied again and again and again and so on. So, how do we know that those copies weren't, erroneous? How do we know that errors weren't introduced deliberately or by mistake? How do we know that what we have now was what was originally written? How do we know it wasn't like a massive game of Chinese whispers, with the end result that we have now completely different to what was originally written? Well, believe it or not, that theory can be tested. It can be tested. We currently have 5,000 whole or partial manuscripts of the New Testament in its original language, which is Greek. Now, if the Chinese whisper effect had been going on, what would you expect to see in those 5,000 manuscripts? You'd expect to see the earlier ones vastly different from the older ones, wouldn't you? That's what you'd expect to see happen. Is that what happened? Well, what do we actually find? Astonishingly, the New Testament scholars, William Nix and Norman Geisler, they have said, they've had a look into this, and they say that the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament are 99.5% identical. They're in agreement to that extent. So we can therefore say that the original text of the New Testament has therefore been remarkably well preserved. And to all intents and purposes, what we read now is what was originally written. Certainly no central Christian claim is affected by these differences. So, that's the first question. The second question is that naturally follows is, how do we know that what was written down was what actually happened? It's all very well if it's arrived to us uncontaminated, unchanged, but what if the guy writing was lying? What if he was doing propaganda? What do we make of that? Well, to answer this question, we have to figure out who wrote it in the first place. And did they have access to reliable testimony? Well, there are four major accounts in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I'm sure you've all heard of them. The general consensus of scholarship points out to the fact that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest of those accounts, written around 50 AD. And the Gospel of John was the last one to be written around 90 AD. And John was an eyewitness and disciple of Jesus himself. So all the authors were either eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus, or they had access, because they were around in the lifetime of eyewitnesses, had access to the events. And so we can therefore conclude that they had at least the potential to write truthfully. Another field of evidence we could look at is external evidence. In other words, is there data outside of the Bible which speaks to it, which corroborates it? Well, there are a number of things we can look at. Imagine if every copy of the New Testament, every quote from the New Testament, all of it just suddenly disappeared overnight for some reason. Imagine if that happened. We could still reconstruct a basic skeleton of the life of Jesus from other secular contemporary accounts that were written about him. We could determine from ancient historians such as Josephus and Tacitus that Jesus was a Jewish teacher and leader, that people believed that he was Messiah, that he performed miracles, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and despite that, many people believe that he was alive after that. We learn from Pliny the Younger that this Jesus movement, people worshipping him, had reached Rome by 64 AD at the latest. So we can tell all this from accounts that aren't Christian. They're secular contemporary accounts. The next field of evidence to look at is archaeology. Now, archaeology, so there's a picture of those people I mentioned earlier. Archaeology is revealing more and more about the general background of the New Testament times, so landmarks, customs, religious sects, civil administration and so on. It's shedding more and more light on these things as time goes on. And these findings constitute powerful corroborative evidence for the historical accuracy of the New Testament. Now, if archaeology is showing that the authors of the New Testament are getting it right, that they're getting the details right, if they're getting the local geography of first century Palestine right, if they're getting the coinage right, if they're getting people's names right, if they're getting local ecology right, if they're getting social stratification right, if they're getting all these really nitty-gritty details right, and so on. After a while, you begin to think, they have so many places to go wrong. They have so many places to go wrong, and yet they don't. This consistent level of accurate detail is not what you would expect if this was the result of legendary development, or if the people recording these things were incompetent, or they got it from 5th, 6th, 7th hand sources. It's not what you would expect to see. Therefore, it's reasonable to suggest that these authors were largely relying on eyewitness testimony. So we're now going to move on away from the external evidence to the internal evidence. Come on, there we go. Fantastic. We're going to look at the internal evidence. In other words, the way that the actual Gospels were written. Now, put up your hand if you've read the Gospels or even a bit of it. Anyone done that? Okay. Keep your hands raised if you found them a little bit boring. Yeah. Okay. I find it quite funny to ask because the Christians go, have a bit of panic in that. They kind of go, I want people to read this, maybe I should keep my hand up. Let's face it, they are quite boring. The language is precise and sober and uncreative. It's not, it doesn't read like Homer's Odyssey or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It doesn't read like that. If you're looking for once upon a time material, you're not going to find it in the Gospels. The pace and narrative is just too plodding, and the language is uncreative. Now, another interesting thing about the Gospels is the way they stick in little irrelevant details into the story. For example, Jesus is being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane at the night before his crucifixion, and in the Gospel of Mark we find a rather strange thing. A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth around his body. They seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. So, this is what we have here. Bizarrely, it wasn't put into the Passion of the Christ film. I wonder why. But anyway, we have a stranger on the field just before Jesus' crucifixion. What's going on here? Well, it's a completely pointless detail. It was put in there because it was a memorable observation by the guy who saw it. That's why it's in there. Now, C.S. Lewis, going back to him, he noticed this sort of thing and said, as a literary historian, I'm perfectly convinced that whatever the Gospels are, they are not legends. I've read a great deal of legends, and I'm quite clear that they are not the same sort of thing. He then goes on to say that the technique of adding pointless details into an otherwise fictional story is a purely modern art, developed in the mid-19th century with the advent of the realistic novel. He says, either this is historical reportage, or else some unknown ancient writer without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. The reader who doesn't see this has not learned how to read. Now, he's a professor, he's kind of patronising, but to get what he's saying, either these were literary entrepreneurs and liars, or they were simply recording events that they saw and including them in the story. That's the choice we have. So, the internal evidence also really begins to pile up when we get to the events of Jesus' resurrection. Now, there's one scene where he comes into a crime scene and looks around meaningfully, and his sidekick says, "What are you looking for?" And he takes off his sunglasses. He's indoors. He's wearing sunglasses. He takes his sunglasses off and goes, and meaningfully says, "It's not the something I'm looking for. It's the absence of something." Now, we're going to look for the absence of something here. The Gospels are remarkably honest. No one actually sees the resurrection happen. No one does. No one sees it or records it. It's more incredible the more you think about it. if you're writing a phony account for propaganda purposes, you couldn't resist the temptation to, you know, add a phony account of, oh, I just happened to be walking through the tombs one day when I saw, you know, Jesus coming out. You know, you wouldn't be able to resist that. But they're brutally honest. We witness an empty tomb, we witness appearances, and all the cool stuff that happens after that. But don't see the resurrection itself. They're brutally honest about it. Now, this is in stark contrast to non-biblical writings that we find, you know, hundreds of years after the events. So the so-called Gospel of Peter, we have an account of the resurrection, a sort of propaganda account of the resurrection, where there's audible voices from heaven, angels descending, tombstone rolling back, Jesus comes out, he's huge, he's a giant, and there's a talking cross. Now that's a resurrection account, isn't it? You know, that's more exciting, isn't it? That's what real legends are made of. We just don't have that in the Gospels. Secondly, all the Gospels attest to the fact that women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Now, that's completely unsurprising to us, but back then that was groundbreaking, because women's testimony, they were so disregarded that women's testimony was not allowed in court. So why do they rely so heavily on the testimony of women? It's very, very strange. Unless, of course, the women's discovery of the empty tomb was a historical fact. Finally, the leaders of a new religion under severe persecution and pressure, if you were the disciples, you'd expect them to, you know, writing phony accounts, you'd expect them to curry favour for themselves, you know, make themselves look good. But they don't. They come across as complete jerks and idiots. You know, they leave their Lord on the cross to rot, essentially. It was one of the, you know, someone else eventually came along, a sort of kind acquaintance who came along and eventually took the body down. They, you know, when the women come back from the empty tomb and start saying, you know, Jesus is alive again, they disbelieve it. In fact, they disbelieve it to the point of saying, no, we've got to reach out and touch him. Only then are we going to believe. So they come across as complete idiots, very, very slow to get to the program. And again, this is not what you would expect from a phony account. So, let's sum up. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's what Socrates said. So, where does the evidence lead us? The evidence points to the fact that the New Testament has not been subject to corruption or change in any significant way since the time it was written. The external evidence from extra-biblical accounts, such as Pliny and Tacitus, and archaeology, in addition to the internal evidence from the way that the Gospels are portrayed, show that not only did the authors have the potential to write accurately, they did write accurately. So, going back to our Lord, Liar, Lunatic structure, it's extremely difficult to intellectually justify consigning the Jesus of the Gospels to the shelf of legend. It's extremely difficult to justify doing that. Jesus of the Gospel stands on the bedrock of historically verifiable fact. His claims to be God are rooted in real history, and his resurrection is rooted in real history. And if he did indeed rise from the dead, then he's not just a man. He's not just a man, he's more than that, and he's endowed with the power over life and death, which belongs to God alone. To be in relationship with the God who knows you better than you know yourself, who created you and loves you unyieldingly, is the most exciting and the most secure and the most natural state a human being can be in. And the New Testament beckons us to enter into a relationship with Jesus and to follow him. As the ending to one of my favourite poems goes, to enjoy him, that is what we are for. In each of our lives he knocks at the door. Will you come to him empty hands upturned, or turn away, fist clenched and unconcerned? Well, I hope that this talk has been helpful to all of you in coming to an informed decision on this matter, and the decision lies before us all. Thank you. So, enough of my monologue. Now it's time for some dialogue. So if you have any questions, feel free to text them through, or alternatively, stick up your hand and yeah, we can have some questions. Go for it.
I was just wondering, like, you know, when you were doing your research, did you not come across the fact that, like, between the four Gospels there were just so many discrepancies? Because I know you mentioned, but I read a book by him where he talks about how all the like numerous discrepancies in all the Gospels was like, one of the reasons why he kind of turned away from God. So I was just wondering, because you didn't really sort of mention that part of like the aspect of the Gospels, so I was wondering how you felt about that sort of judgment.
I mean, it's difficult to answer it in a general way, in a short answer, because obviously there's all sorts of alleged discrepancies and so on. I've got a book on my shelf called Encyclopedia of Biblical Difficulties, which is about that big, and I got bored reading it, to be honest. But it is a subject of study that there's both sides trying to work these things out. For example, there is a account in, I can't remember which gospel it is, but it says that Judas hanged himself, and then another account in Acts, I think, where it says that he fell over in the field and he fell in the field and his guts spilled out. How do you join those two up together? If you go to Israel and you go to the traditional site of the place where Judas died, the Potter's Field it's called, it is actually next to a cliff, and so there's a possibility that he hanged himself over the side of a cliff. And something happened and he fell and obviously had a serious injury from that. That's the sort of thing that people have tried to look into, and I think basically whenever you've got a sort of stereo sound view of an event where you've got lots and lots of different events, people having independent views, if they matched up too closely, you'd obviously think they colluded, but if there's enough agreement in what they're saying, and some of the differences that if there's space for seeing how they might be able to just about make with each other, then you think that the actual events that they were looking at were real. I think what's quite interesting is that none of the really, really important aspects of Jesus' life, death and resurrection are in question. So, for example, how many women were at the tomb when it was discovered? That's not quite established, I think it's an open question. Things like that. So small details, yes, they are in question, but the big details: was the tomb empty? Was it discovered by women? All these things. Did he die under Pontius Pilate? These sorts of core truths, they are not in dispute. The really central things are pretty well established. So, sort of part way on. It's a huge question with lots of little questions under it. So, okay. Yeah.
When you talk about the relevant details in the accounts, I don't understand why they can't be retold from an eyewitness experience and put in made up stuff. Why are they mutually exclusive?
You're right, but I guess it's just another feature of the narrative that shows that it was, there was an eyewitness testimony involved. Whether you can prove that every single little bit of it was true is actually quite difficult to do. But what you can do is you can put up various tests to see does it pass these tests, and if it does pass the test, do we have reasonable grounds for doubting it? Until an actual problem is brought up, to lead us to doubt. That's kind of where it works out. So, certainly the pointless detail test, as it were, it adds credibility to the account, but it certainly doesn't prove that everything that's said down to the last details is true. Or rather demonstrably true. Anything else? Any other questions?
There's a question on the phone, which says, if Peter's Gospel was put in the Bible, wouldn't Christians just believe it? They'd find reason to accept it. Things like a token cross, water into wine, Jesus being a giant. Surely Christians could just claim these things are miracles.
Right. So can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
So, talking about Peter's Gospel,
yep.
If it was put into the Bible, wouldn't Christians just accept it and pass off all the slightly odd things as miracles?
I guess one of the problems with that question is that it's a counterfactual. It isn't in the Bible, and the reason why it wasn't in the Bible is because it was written so far beyond the events, and because it included so many strange details that, basically, but the people who put the New Testament together, they wanted the most reliable accounts they could get their hands on. And if in doubt, chuck it out, was their motto, as it were. And the Gospel of Peter was written too long after the events to be considered to be reliable. And there were lots of things in there which just didn't sound right, basically. So on that ground, it wasn't included. Whereas, what we do have in the Gospel, I would say that there aren't things in there that are unreasonable. I don't see why the resurrection, based on the background information of who Jesus was and what he said about himself and the reliability of the stories in themselves, I don't see why it's implausible. Yes. Any other questions?
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Robbie. Thank you guys for coming. Feel free to stick around and chat. Robbie's here for 50 minutes before the next kind of he'll answer any difficult questions. Some biscuits have miraculously appeared on the side, so it does.